Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Michelle O'Connor and I run the caregiver training series. So we have a portion where I present on information and then caregivers get to ask questions. We can give input throughout as well. If you were not able to join us last time, I'm going to do a little bit of a review about what is ABA and then we'll get into today's topic, which is how do we actually select goals. So, a review from last time, we talked about the ABCs of behavior change. So, within ABA, our ultimate goal is we want to change a behavior, but how do we do that? So, in order to change a behavior, we want to alter a response. We have to understand what maintains that behavior, what keeps it going. So, why does your client or why does your kiddo display that certain behavior? We look for causes in the environment. And once we can understand why we display a certain behavior, now we can work to change those things. So we can alter the behavior, and the way that we do that is through manipulating or changing the antecedents. So we talk about a lot of behaviors, but we don't talk about that just in isolation. We have to talk about the antecedent, which is everything that occurred before the behavior. The behavior, which is oftentimes what we focus on. So, what's working for the child, what's not working for the child? What do we want to change? What do we want to maintain, or what do we want to increase? The consequence, we have to look at after that behavior is displayed by the child, what's the consequence? So, what occurs directly after the behavior? Do we give attention to the child? Do they escape something in the environment? And only when we can understand not just the behavior itself, but also that antecedent, what occurred right before, and that consequence, what occurred right after, then we can look at the result and we can have an evaluation. We can look at what's the impact on the behavior. What if we change something about the antecedent? Or what if we change the consequence? Does it increase the behavior? Does it decrease the behavior? Is that successful? Is it not successful? And that's how your ABA team develops behavior. That's how we track progress, we monitor progress, and we develop our interventions based off of that. The other thing that your ABA team really needs in order to target certain behaviors is we have to develop goals. So when you look at the treatment plan, we look at a series of behaviors, but we also look at different goals of what we want to change for this client. So it's really important to get that input from the caregiver. We should be collaborating with your ABA teams. Don't be afraid to give input of what you really want to see in that treatment plan. It can be things that the analyst presents to you that they think is important for your child, but you also want to advocate as a caregiver and make sure that you get what you need in that plan. So give them lots of background information. Talk about what is meaningful for you, what would really make an impact on the child. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about social significance. So there's a bunch of research, and really what started the basis of ABA back in 1968. There was a journal article that was published by Bayer and his associates, and he tells us that how immediately important is this behavior or these stimuli to the subject or our client or our child in this case. So even back when ABA was first started, there's a huge focus on selecting things that are really important for this individual. It's going to have a really meaningful impact, and that's what we should focus on. So we want to make sure that our goals are really relevant to this particular child that we're working with. The larger term you're going to hear for that is social significance. And really, what that means is it has this meaningful impact. It's meaningful for the kiddo, and it's meaningful for you as the family of that child. We want to help change that, and we want to help the child and family immediately. So, by identifying goals and targets that are high with social significance, we can have an immediate impact, we can have an immediate change on the behaviors that this client is displaying. We also look a little bit beyond just the here and now and that immediacy factor, and we can look at those long term changes as well. But we also do want to focus, especially in the beginning, on what do we want to target right now? How can we have this immediate impact on the child and family so that we can improve the lives of the child and you as the caregivers? We want to target things that we can alter and change relatively quickly in the beginning so that we can see, wow, this is successful when we implement these interventions. Once we know that things are working and we get some of those basic behaviors under control, then we can look at other types of goals. So we do have to prioritize a little bit. They should all be socially significant, but maybe we spend a little bit more time on certain types of behaviors before we move into those lower priority behaviors. Maybe first we have to get under control some of the aggression. We have to establish our presence that we're running these ABA therapy sessions. And then we can eventually work towards sustaining prolonged periods of leisure skills, for instance. But maybe some of the other goals would take precedence first. So, you as the caregiver, don't be afraid to speak up, talk to your ABA team. What's important for you? What's important for your client to change? Social significance can be practiced within current methods of ABA. So, when we look at definitions, if you have seen a behavior plan before, or when you look at that, you can see a huge portion of the behavior plan is devoted to clearly defining the behaviors. And this means all of those socially significant behaviors that we looked at, that we identified. So you sit down with your provider, you come up with a list of what we want to see changed, and then you and your analyst work together to how to now do we define that behavior. So it has a clear operational definition. Then we need to select those different goals or behaviors for change. So this is where we prioritize. Maybe we are focusing on all of that list that we came up with, or maybe we're focusing on a few at first. And then once we see some success with that, then we can get to the other items that were developed on the list. Part of what we do in ABA2 is after we define behaviors, after we select which ones we're going to target, now we have to measure those. So we need to see if what we are doing is actually effective. And if it's not effective, so if our data is not showing that we're reducing a maladaptive behavior, or if we're not increasing a skill acquisition, then we need to do something else. We need to change our interventions. And the only way to know if we have success or not is if we are measuring. So that's part of why we have to work really hard to clearly define the behavior so that RBTs can take data collection to inform the analyst of how are we changing programming. If it's successful, what are we keeping the same? What else are we going to add in so that we can move this learner along? If we see that that maladaptive behavior is decreasing, maybe the frequency is becoming less, or maybe it occurs still just as often as frequently, but the intensity is much less. So maybe they used to have a tantrum and it lasted 30 minutes. Now we still see that they have 5 tantrums a day, but they're only 1 minute each. So our interventions are successful. And we would leave those interventions in place, maybe some minor changes. But overall, we're able to measure that what we're doing seems to be successful. If we see that behaviors are increasing or they are maintaining, so let's say that our child is still having 5 tantrums a day, they still last 30 minutes, it's still very intense when these behaviors occur, then we would say that our interventions are not being very successful. Maybe it needs a little bit more time to implement that, or maybe we have to change our intervention methods. So these are discussions for the team. Update the team, talk to your ABA team and let them know if things are working, if things are not working. What does it look like when they are out of the house? Are you able to implement those things? And we do this through measurement. So we have to pay attention to if the behavior is increasing or decreasing. Also, be mindful of those antecedents and those consequences that surround the behavior. The more information you can give your team, the better chance we have at developing successful ways to have a socially significant and meaningful impact on these kids. So, when we think about social significance, we think about prioritizing our objectives, we really need to look at selecting a specific behavior goal. So, for the plans, we get really specific of how that's outlined. And there's certain things that constitute a good goal. So if we're looking at a SMART goal, it's going to include a couple different things that we'll go through, and that really helps to make a very good behavior goal that we can actually measure and that we can alter things if we're not seeing that progress. So if we're looking at socially significant goals and we want them to be really objective, that means that the goals that your child's working on in ABA services should be based on real facts. We want things to be based on overt measures, things that we can see in the environment. We don't necessarily want the goals to be influenced by a personal belief or a feeling. So when we can develop goals that are more objective and they leave out some of those motivational type of feelings or states of the child, what we're trying to do is develop a goal that is a SMART goal. And the reason we do that is because it can then follow what we follow in ABA, which is the scientific method, and we have to have a way to measure and track progress. So, things that are included in a SMART goal, we want them to be really specific. So, they clearly define the goal. And in ABA, that might be the behavior or a skill that's targeted for the intervention. So, being really specific here helps you know when that goal has been achieved. So, if you look at the behavior plans, you'll see that we might break down an aggressive behavior into different types of aggression. So, if we're able to lower one type of aggression, we've shown success, but we are not just interested in reducing hitting, we're also interested in reducing biting. So, we might be really specific and break those goals up into tiny little chunks. Same for the skills that we're trying to increase. We look at that skill acquisition. We want to be really specific. What do we want this child to do? And that's how we break up some of our objectives into really mini goals. And it's all really clearly outlined within the behavior plan. Another dimension that makes a goal a really good goal is this idea of, can we measure it or not? So for measurability, we're looking at, can we quantify that targeted skill or that behavior so that we can actually measure it? We want to make sure that we can assess the behavior or that targeted skill to see what kind of progress is being made, or is there not progress being made. We have to be careful about the way that we word that. You and your analyst can work together on that. Your analyst has a lot of ideas of what funding sources will accept. There are some specific type of words that we have to use for that, or ways that we have to break it down. But when we look at the visual analysis, also that helps to measure progress that we're either seeing or we're not seeing. The other thing we have to be mindful of when we're creating a goal is that it should be attainable. So we want to make sure that the goal is acceptable to you, to the client, to everyone on the team, but it has to be realistic. So there are ways that we can get the client to that end goal, but maybe we have to start with smaller steps for it. And we can have that broken down into the plan of different ways that we can get the client to that long term objective by going through a series of short term objectives. When we look at independence, for instance, maybe we are always going to need some level of support. It's not going to be fully independent, but we can look at ways at significantly reducing the prompts needed or that level of independence. And maybe the client's always going to have some kind of visual reminder, but we would want to fade the dependence on another person having to be there. If we look at potty training, then maybe we're first focusing on staying dry and using the potty during the day, and then we're going to tackle nighttime. So in the end, we can attain all of those goals, but again, we might have to prioritize, we might have to see what can we realistically achieve, and that helps determine how we write those goals. The next thing that we look for in a goal is the goal relevant? So this really gets into that social significance. Is it important to you? Is it important to the client? Is it meaningful? And we want it to be a worthwhile goal. If you're going to put in the time and the effort to achieving it, we want it to be impactful. We want it to mean something to you. If you don't really care that the child does this, or it's not going to aid in the child's ability to access things in the environment or to engage socially, then we can look at as a team, do we need that in the behavior plan at this time? Maybe we put that on hold for a while and we come back to it. The last thing on here that makes a SMART goal or a good goal would be it has to be written in a way that's time bound. So when we look at goals and the wording of it, there should be a set amount of time that we are predicting for this goal to be accomplished. One of the reasons that the behavior plan breaks it down from just those end goals or those long term objectives is because that can take a really long time. If we're looking at potty training, for instance, that could be months, it could be years, depending on the client. If we break it down into little steps, our short-term objectives, it gives us a better sense of where should the client be in this process. What steps are we taking? How independent are they in that? Have they met those mini goals to then help them meet that larger goal? Here's a visual. So this is what we talked about on the other slide, but if you are more of a visual learner and you want to see it, this is a graphic here from Courtesy Graphic, and it goes through and talks about what do the letters mean for a SMART goal. So on the left, the S, we want them to be really specific. We are talking about who, what, where, when, why, which. We are defining the goal and we're using as much overt objective measures as we can. We don't want to be ambiguous when we look at this language. So if I pick up that goal, I should be able to exactly see who is involved in it, what do I want to accomplish, where is it going to be done, why am I doing this? So what's the rationale? Why did I select this goal? What types of behaviors is it targeting? If there are certain constraints or there's requirements that you have to do within that, it can be clearly outlined within that goal. So lots of detail goes into this specific measure. Second box, the M. So when we look at if something is measurable, we have to make sure, can we actually track that progress? Can we measure the outcome of what we decided in box one? So yeah, we have something that's really specific, but now how do we go about tracking progress for that? So we could talk about how much of that behavior we want to see or how many times. How are we going to know when our end goal is accomplished? Do we want to see a decrease in the frequency and how many times the behavior occurs, or do we care more about how long the behavior is occurring and we're looking at duration? Are we looking at the intensity? And that's what we're trying to decrease. So when you look at the short-term objectives and the long-term objectives in our plans at PBS, they're very specific. And that's why we do that. We have to have them specifically defined, but then we have to also have them measurable. The third box on here, so the A, we need things to be attainable. So this really gets into the how. How are we going to do this? We have a goal that's specific. We've outlined how we're going to measure it. But now, is this a reasonable goal to be accomplished? And if so, how? How are we going to do this? So we want to make sure that the goal is within the client's reach. And then when you read through the plan, you're going to see specific steps of how do we get the client to meet those objectives. What are the procedures we're using? What types of interventions are we using? What are the mini goals that we want to have in place before we can meet some of those long term objectives? Next box on here is relevant. So R. This is asking, is it really worthwhile for the team? So this goal that we developed, is it going to meet your needs? And as it's written and it's specific and it's measurable, and yes, we say it's attainable, is it something that's going to, when it's met, does that fulfill what you were looking for initially? We want to make sure that each goal is also consistent with the other goals. So we can have maybe two or three goals that can help you get to that end objective. Maybe we need to work on the client learning to listen to directions and following directions. And we also have to work on some language goals, and we're targeting um, routine compliance. So maybe in the end, you want your child to get up in the morning, complete the school routine with a good bit of independence. So that's a really relevant goal for you. But in order to get the client there, maybe we have to work on several other goals at the same time, because for morning routine completion, there's a lot of independence. There's a lot of direction following that happens. So we might need other goals in there so that they're able to meet this end goal that is really relevant to you. But somewhere within the plan, we want to know that those goals are relevant, it's worthwhile, it's going to be meaningful for you and the child. The last box all the way on the right here. So T, when we look at something that's timely, this is getting at when. So your objective should include a time limit. We have estimates of when we would complete certain objectives, and they're a timetable, which can be flexible. Sometimes we meet those deadlines, sometimes we don't, but you want to try to establish a sense of what do we need to accomplish first and how long might that take before we can move on to something else. You don't necessarily just want a goal in there, and you never know when is that going to be attained. Is it going to take 1 week? Is it going to take a year? So the SDOs try to break it up in our plans of how long you could expect those little mini steps to take. So, thinking about a SMART goal and how we develop that and why we develop it like that within ABA, there's a lot of different types of socially significant behaviors that we could develop into SMART goals. So, they could be included in your behavior plan. The behavior plan should be really specific to what's relevant for you, relevant for the child. So, some examples of what could be included and we could teach a child and we could track in the behavior plans would be things related to routines or tasks. So maybe we're looking at toothbrushing. Maybe we're looking at dressing. We could be looking at packing or unpacking a backpack. We could be looking at making a snack. We could be cleaning up after yourself. You could look at washing your face, completing some of those needed routines. Related to routines, we could look specifically at chores. Maybe we want this kiddo to clean. Maybe we want them to unload the dishwasher or wash the dishes by hand. We could look at laundry, either doing laundry or folding laundry, putting it away. Toilet training is one. That could be during the day, it could be during car rides, it could be at night, it could be all of those things. Different types of sleep routines and schedules. So maybe bedtime is a really big struggle, and you want the ABA team to help you make that less of a battle. You want that to be a smoother process. Communication and language. So we talk a lot about functional communication training in ABA. Probably somewhere within your child's plan, there is a goal in there related to FCT or functional communication training. We want the client to have a way to express themselves. We want them to do that instead of some of the maladaptive behaviors. So we have to teach them some skills of how we can more appropriately express ourselves. Leisure skills and engagement. So if your child doesn't display a lot of interest or they move around from different task areas often, it could be that we need to look at different types of leisure skills and engagement type of activities. Task engagement and completion. So this could be a leisure skill activity, or it could be homework, or it could be sitting down to eat dinner. And we want the client to better engage, remain on task, and complete that task start to finish. Compliance to directives could be one-step directions you're giving, could be two-step directions. Maybe they're related. So it could be get your socks and get your shoes, or they could be totally unrelated. Put this mm, put this paper on the counter and go get your shoes. And can the client comply with those types of directions? Transitioning. So maybe we're going from something the client really likes to something they don't like, or vice versa. Are they able to do that with ease? Social engagement and back and forth. So a lot of times we see clients like to talk about what they want to talk about, or they'll play with a certain toy. But when it comes to that flexibility piece, or really that back and forth with others, we may have to have a goal in there that focuses on that. Other things to consider. So, safety compliance. Maybe your kid elopes a lot. So, if you're going to the store, you don't trust to let go of their hand. You have to hold their hand the whole time because they're not aware of cars in the parking lot. They don't look for cars when they cross the street. Maybe you're cooking at home and they go to reach for food that they want, but it's a hot stove and they shouldn't reach right into that. Or they try to get something from the toaster. We can look at self-stimulatory behaviors or our automatically reinforced behaviors. These are going to be repetitive types of behaviors. Could be hand flapping. It could be certain phrases even that the client perseverates on. But we want to try to reduce some of these. So talking with your ABA team about what's realistic for those. Maybe we can't bring it completely down to zero, but we could reduce how often it occurs, or we could look at when and where it occurs. So maybe when you're supposed to be engaged on a task, you're not engaged in these behaviors. But if you're alone in the bedroom, you may engage in those behaviors. On task behaviors. So when we want the client to attend to a certain task, we don't want them to get distracted. We don't want them to fidget. Personal space boundaries. Maybe your client is really clingy with you or other kids, and we want them to be mindful that we can't sit on top of someone's lap all the time. Maybe we don't want to hug strangers in public. Prompt dependency. So, a lot of the clients that we work with within ABA need a level of support. That's why they're getting services. Eventually, we want to work to fade the prompts that they need and work toward more independence. We could look at a failure to request or comment or respond. So if you say something to your child, you want them to reply back. And if they're not, then we can work on that within the behavior plan. And the last one on here is etc. Because really you can develop anything that you want for one of these goals, and then it comes down to your team figuring out a way. How can we write that in the plan? How can we measure that? How can we track that? So those are the beginning basics of how do we select goals? Why do we have to do it like that to stay within the constructs of ABA as a science? Big takeaway is that you can help, and please do help. It is difficult for a clinician to come into a client's life and develop these goals. You know your child best, so get involved, ask questions, observe, give us input, give us suggestions for goals. We can help you with the wording of it. We can make sure that it fits into a SMART goal, but please don't hesitate to give us suggestions of what you want in that plan. Make it socially significant for you and your child. Practice and carryover programming. So even though the ABA staff might not be in the home, test things out. See if it's effective. Does the client comply when you ask them to do those things? Are they dependent on just the RBT doing it? Part of the authorizations can focus on caregiver training, and we want the client to respond to not just us, but everyone when we do it. So ask for tips, ask for modeling, ask for help when needed. You are a really important part of your child's services. So make sure that you're asking those questions, you're getting things in the plan that's really important for you. Part of the caregiver series is questions. So if questions ever occur either during the trainings, I am happy to talk about that as a group. We can get input and feedback from everyone else. If you are not comfortable asking those questions, you can also submit them in writing through the website, and it's something I can address then when we meet as a group. These are the references of some things that we had talked about, and I will see you next time.